I think there are a lot of sort of people in the middle ground. I mean, by people, I mean in the central banking world, who are in the middle ground, who understand that physical gold is no one else's liability, whereas the dollar is a liability of the United States.
My question, I guess, here, Alasdair, is this. I'm referring to Jim Sinclair's reference. So I'll ask you, why do central banks own gold? And why should we follow their lead on this one and only policy? Right?
I think it's a very good question. I think the answer is that it depends how Keynesian the central bank is. I mean, if it's completely Keynesian, like the Canadians, they see no reason to hold any gold whatsoever. I think there are a lot of sort of people in the middle ground. I mean, by people, I mean in the central banking world, who are in the middle ground, who understand that physical gold is no one else's liability, whereas the dollar is a liability of the United States, and so on and so forth. So, on those grounds, it makes sense for them to hold gold. I mean, there are very, very few central banks which really are, if you like, promoters of sound money or understanders of sound money, but they are in there. I mean, I've met a few in the past, particularly in Middle Europe, who've learned the lesson from the days of communism, perhaps, understanding the importance of banking stability and currency stability. And I think this is also true of a cadre of sound money people in the Bundesbank. And I just note with great interest that Jens Wiedemann, who was very definitely a sound money man, sort of resigned last year. Now that I've looked at in detail at the situation on the Bundesbank's balance sheet, I can understand that I wouldn't want to have part of this at all. So, there are a variety of opinions. And then, of course, the other thing is that laws come into it. I understand that the situation with the Italians, the Italians hold, the Italian central bank holds huge amounts of gold. I can't remember the exact figures, but places Italy in the sort of top 5, if you like, and they've got, the most appalling economic performance. It's mismanagement and all the rest of it, but they still hold on to their gold. But I understand that there is a thing in Italian law that the gold was actually taken in from the commercial banks into the central bank. So the central bank is in the position of being a custodian of the other bank's gold. So legally, they can't really sort of just dump it. But it also raises, I think, the possibility, and we must be aware of this, that as central banks get into difficulties, that they will dispose of some of their gold in order to try and get out of their difficulties. And they will probably, at the same time, some of them will want to drive down the price of gold, because gold, if you like, is an indication of loss or changing confidence in fiat currency. So if the gold price, goes through the roof, it's not exactly sending a good message about central bank currencies. So, so there are a number of things, I think, to consider along the line. It's also not impossible that, a central bank and backed up by its government will introduce restrictions on gold ownership. So under those circumstances, you could find that if you want to buy gold, it's an illegal act. It could be that actually owning gold is an illegal act. That was the situation following the Roosevelt move, the executive order in 1933. I happen to think that nowadays, any government doing that, basically, you find that people would just clam up. They'll just hold on to their gold and say, I haven't got any gold. go and talk to someone else. So. Leave me alone. Stop pestering me.
Yeah.
I don't think people are so compliant as they were in those days. I think that's the important thing. So, all these policies would just make the situation worse for the currencies. So, I think this is the other thing that we need to know about owning gold and silver, and that is, it's not necessarily going to be a smooth ride, but it's the only way in which, once the whole thing is sorted out, you're going to have anything left. This is if we get a collapse of fiat currencies, which I fully expect, and I do understand that is an extreme position to take. But I feel quite comfortable taking it. Other people might not feel comfortable going along with that argument. But I would still say, don't use that as an excuse to say that, gold ownership is blown up by the gold bugs and, I'm having none of it. I mean, I think that would be a very foolish thing to do. We've used the phrase before, insurance policy. Have just a little bit of insurance policy. And the difference between this and an insurance policy is an insurance premium, once paid, is lost. This insurance premium, you retain.
You retain, exactly.
Yeah.
I do have one question. Just recently, it's just been confirmed that their Reserve Bank, the RBI, has purchased 77.5 metric tonnes of gold in 2021, which is their second highest, biggest purchase ever. And of course, we know Russia and China are seriously in the gold. Interestingly enough, if I can ask you this question, it's just come to mind, Alasdair. What would happen if they opened up Fort Knox? Now, Fort Knox, 1953 was the last time they had an audit. What would happen if they opened it up? And it's been resisted many times, of course, because the question's been asked on numerous occasions. But if they did, and there was nothing inside, what would that do to everyone's confidence in the American dollar?
Well, it would completely undermine confidence in the dollar. I think it's as simple as that. Because what it would confirm is the suspicions that the Americans basically have tried to suppress the price of gold by leaching into the market to try and keep it down for the last 40 years. And interestingly, on this one, there was an analyst called Frank Veneroso who, at a speech in Lima in 2002, said that he estimated that between 10 and 15,000 tons of central bank gold was subject to leases into the market. In other words, at that time, what he was saying was that up to 50% of the gold reserves in the world's central banks and treasuries didn't exist. It wasn't there. And I think this, the scenario that you've painted is entirely consistent with his analysis. Now, I do know that Frank Veneroso spoke to an old chum of mine called Terry Smeaton, who was the head of foreign exchange at the Bank of England in those days. I mean, Terry's now dead. I used to lunch with him occasionally. I just wish I'd asked more questions. And so, I mean, he was getting this information in those days. This information wasn't deemed so incredibly sensitive that, the Bank of England would just sit on all information. Terry was, sort of quite open with Veneroso, from Veneroso's accounts anyway, about the scale of leasing that was going on. And of course, this is another thing which the IMF accounting practices, which, the IMF, if you like, sort of provides the accounting framework with respect to the gold holdings in the central banks. It says that, gold which is out on lease or loan or swapped or whatever can be included in a central bank's records of its gold ownership, of its physical gold, because obviously at some stage, under the obligation, it's going to return. But what it leads to is a huge amount of double counting, because the banks which have maybe, if central bank A has leased gold from central bank B, it has increased the gold in its ownership. So how is it going to account for that? It will probably make a return that it's got, what it had before, plus what it's got, subject to lease, which has come in. So there's a lot of jiggery pokery going on with the accounting in the central bank.
Yes.
And I mean, the idea that that 10 to 15,000 tons has sort of all come back. I mean, the one thing I would say is that practices have changed somewhat, but not entirely. I mean, we had a situation where GLD, the big ETF, suddenly reported, I think this was August 2 years ago, when gold spiked up to over 2050 or whatever. They reported a sub-custodian being the Bank of England. In other words, what had happened was that there wasn't enough gold in the market to satisfy the purchases of people who were buying shares in this enormous ETF. So they had to borrow it from the Bank of England, but the Bank of England wouldn't let it outside its vaults. So it became a custodian. Now there's double counting. Who owns that gold? I mean, it was probably owned by a central bank. And I had an interesting situation because I had a friend in Finland who was who became an MP over there, and he helped me translate a blog of the head of the Finnish central bank, and that blog said, they were very proud that of their 62 tons or whatever Finland owned at the time, they had over half of it out on lease. This is what he said in the blog. So I reported this, and it caused a bit of a kerfuffle. And the next thing we knew, the blog had been taken down. So you can see, the Bank of England basically acts as a ringmaster for providing liquidity in gold to try and sort of keep some control over the price. I mean, I don't know that's definitely the objective, but I think we can be pretty sure that that's the objective. They don't want to see the price run away. I mean, whether you say it's because it sort of upsets the confidence in the fiat currencies, or whether they're just concerned about the short positions of the bullion banks and don't want to exacerbate them. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, for whatever reason, they are sitting on the price by synthetically expanding the quantity of gold. And I think, coming back to your point about the US gold reserves, US Treasury gold reserves, I mean, over the last 40 years, anything can have happened. And I would not be surprised if, as you say, they threw open the gates and all you found were a few sort of dead spiders.